Imagine, if you will, the space around you transforming right now.
To completely shift it.
Yeah, exactly. Picture a vibrant, deeply interconnected cityscape. It's pulsing with lights, traffic, commerce, millions of lives intersecting in this chaotic but functional rhythm.
Right.
Now watch as those concrete steel and glass structures slowly dissolve. They just morph into an intricate, glowing blue architectural blueprint.
A literal schematic of human society.
Exactly, a literal schematic. And that is the visual we really need to hold on to today, because we are pulling back the curtain on the very design of the civilization that you and I inhabit every single day.
It's a huge topic.
It really is. We've got an incredibly extensive deep dive lined up for you, our listener, sitting right here as the third person at the table with us in this intellectual journey.
Glad to have you here.
We are going to be exploring some incredibly dense, paradigm-shifting excerpts from a text titled The Architecture of Human Flourishing.
It is a dense text, but so rewarding.
Oh, absolutely. And our mission today is to explore a radical premise presented in these pages. The idea that modern society, for all its dazzling technological wonders, is essentially built backward.
Completely inverted.
Right. We are looking at a system focused obsessively on cleaning up the damage of human despair, rather than designing a world that actually prevents that despair from taking root in the first place.
Which is a heavy thought.
It is. So, okay, let's unpack this. Because the core irony we are about to look at is something that fundamentally shifts how you view, well, every headline, every tax bracket, every social crisis.
It forces a complete reevaluation of the foundational metrics by which we measure the success of a civilization. I mean, this material challenges the baseline assumption that our current definitions of progress, wealth, and stability are actually aligned with human biology, or psychology for that matter.
Right, because we just assume that wealth equals success.
Exactly. But the synthesis of these excerpts suggests we have engineered a society brilliantly optimized for economic output, but structurally deficient when it comes to the psychological and social load-bearing walls that actually make life sustainable.
Load-bearing walls. I like that phrasing.
Yeah, it is a very cold, analytical diagnosis of the modern condition. It treats societal failure not as a series of unfortunate accidents, but as the predictable outcome of a flawed design.
See, the word predictable is what really jumped out at me. Let's jump right into the first major theme of the source material. They call it the great irony of modern civilization.
The great irony.
Right. The authors argue that governments around the world spend trillions, literally trillions, annually responding to violence, addiction, chronic disease, mass incarceration, environmental collapse, geopolitical conflict. We pour unbelievable amounts of wealth and human capital into managing these crises.
Just astronomical sums of money.
And yet, the text points out that relatively little is invested in fulfilling the fundamental human needs that prevent these massive problems from arising in the first place.
Which is the core of managing despair.
Yes. It is a massive, industrialized system dedicated almost entirely to managing alienation and insecurity, but only after they have already metastasized.
The distinction the source material makes between a reactive civilization and a proactive one is crucial here. A reactive civilization waits for that alienation to fully manifest into tangible, destructive problems.
We wait until it's too late.
Precisely. We wait until the person is chemically dependent, until the violent act has occurred, until the chronic stress has triggered the myocardial infarction. And then, and only then, do we deploy this massive apparatus of hospitals, courts, and emergency services.
We're basically just treating the symptoms.
Exactly. We are treating the damage caused by a fractured foundation. The proactive model proposed in the text flips that sequence entirely. It suggests cultivating belonging, competence, and stability from the beginning, recognizing that human flourishing isn't just a pleasant byproduct of a functioning economy.
Right, it should be the actual goal.
Yes, the central, non-negotiable objective of governance itself.
It's the classic ambulance at the bottom of the cliff scenario.
Oh, that's a perfect analogy.
Right. You have a dangerous cliff. People keep falling off. And instead of building a sturdy fence at the top, the town spends its entire budget on a fleet of elite ambulances parked at the bottom.
State-of-the-art ambulances.
Exactly, with the best medics. They build trauma centers at the base of the ravine, they develop incredible surgical techniques for fall victims, and they celebrate having the best ambulance response time in the world.
While ignoring the fact that people are still falling.
Right. But what this text does brilliantly is push past that basic analogy and quantify the literal mathematical cost of the ambulance fleet versus the fence.
The sheer mathematics of the misallocation.
And you, listening to this right now, you need to care about this because this irony dictates where your tax dollars go. It explains the underlying humming anxiety of modern life that so many of us feel.
And the psychological toll of that anxiety is profound. When a society treats fulfillment as a secondary outcome, like an accidental bonus you might achieve if you navigate the economic maze perfectly, it establishes a baseline of chronic insecurity.
Because it's not guaranteed.
No, it's not. The unspoken contract is that your security, your sense of belonging, your search for meaning, those are entirely your own private problems to solve.
You're on your own.
Exactly. You are expected to solve them in isolation, while participating in a system that doesn't structurally care if you achieve them. Operating against human nature in this way requires enormous energy.
It's exhausting.
It is. The text argues that a civilization organized around human fulfillment would reverse this logic entirely, making prevention and human development the primary investment.
I want to test that premise, though. Because looking at history, is it possible that we are reactive simply because it's easier to measure a crisis than it is to measure prevention?
That is a very fair question.
Because a hospital treating a heart attack has a very clear metric of success. The patient lives or dies. A police force making an arrest has a clear metric. How do you measure offense? How do you measure a crisis that didn't happen because someone felt a sense of belonging in their community?
That is the exact systemic trap the authors identify. Our entire economic apparatus is built on measuring transactions and interventions. A crisis generates economic activity.
Wow, yeah.
Prevention often does not, at least not in a way that our current accounting systems easily capture. If a community center prevents 10 at-risk youths from entering the criminal justice system, the state saves millions of dollars over the next decade.
But nobody gets a bonus for that.
Right. That saved money doesn't show up as a positive spike on a quarterly economic report. The intervention, the arrest, the trial, the incarceration, that generates jobs, facility contracts, and measurable data points.
So the breakdown itself is profitable.
Yes. The text argues that we have allowed our measurement tools to dictate our values, rather than letting our values dictate what we measure.
Which brings us directly to the framework the authors used to define those values, the acronym CONAF.
CONAF.
We need to dive incredibly deep into this because it is the entire engine of this text's philosophy. CONAF stands for the Circle of Needs and Fulfillment.
The foundational pillars.
Exactly. The text states that human beings, regardless of culture, geography, or time period, require fulfillment across 7 distinct, interconnected domains. Let's get the map in front of us. 1. Safety and security.
2. Affirmation and belonging.
3. Competence and mastery.
4. Healthy superiority and achievement.
5. Stimulation and engagement.
6. Meaning and purpose.
And 7. Sexuality and intimacy.
Understanding the biological and sociological weight of these 7 domains is the pivot point of the entire source material. The text insists these are not luxuries.
They aren't just nice to have.
No, they are not the cherry on top of the civilizational sundae. They are the load-bearing walls. The core assertion is that when these specific needs are neglected or fractured, human beings do not just quietly accept the void.
They compensate.
They compensate. And that compensation frequently takes the form of maladaptive behaviors. If you don't have true affirmation and belonging, you might seek it in tribalism, extremism, or gang affiliation.
Because you have to get it somewhere.
Exactly. If you lack meaning and purpose, nihilism or escapism become highly attractive. Addiction, violence, and exploitation are framed here largely as the predictable, systemic results of a starved CONAF.
Let's pull apart some of these specific domains to see how they function in reality. Starting with competence and mastery.
A huge one in our modern economy.
Huge. The text draws a razor-sharp contrast between our current system and actual human mastery. Right now, we operate heavily on competitive credential systems.
Degrees, certificates, test scores.
Right. You memorize information, you take a standardized test, you acquire a piece of paper, and that credential proves you are worthy of employment. But the text argues this is a hollow substitute for lifelong mastery and contribution.
It's an artificial proxy.
Yes, because humans inherently want to be genuinely good at things. They crave craftsmanship, deep technical excellence, the ability to solve complex problems, and they want that competence to be useful to their community.
True intrinsic motivation.
When we replace actual mastery with a highly stressful, high-stakes race for credentials, We end up with a society of heavily credentialed people who feel entirely alienated from the actual value of their daily work.
And the psychological difference between extrinsic motivation, the credential, and intrinsic motivation, the mastery, is staggering.
It changes how you approach everything.
It does. When you are driven by a credential, the goal is to do the minimum required to pass the barrier. When you are driven by mastery, the goal is continuous growth.
You actually want to learn.
What's fascinating here is how the text suggests that our educational and economic systems heavily incentivize the former, which starves the natural human desire to deeply understand and manipulate the world. This leads to a pervasive sense of imposter syndrome in the modern workforce.
Oh, everyone feels that.
Because people have the degrees, but they don't feel the internal weight of true competence.
But I want to push back on the idea that a starved CONAF is the root of all destructive behavior. Let's look at white-collar crime.
Okay, let's look at it.
You have Wall Street executives, or massive corporate fraudsters, who seemingly have full belonging in elite circles. They have massive competence in finance, total physical and financial security, and yet they still commit massive fraud that harms millions.
Right.
Does the framework hold up there? They don't look like they have a starved CONAF.
That is an excellent stress test of the framework, and it brings us directly to the fourth domain the text identifies.
Yeah.
Healthy superiority and achievement.
Superiority is a tricky word.
The word superiority carries a lot of baggage, yes, but the authors frame it as a natural human desire for distinction. Humans want to achieve, stand out, and push the boundaries of their potential.
We want to be recognized for being good at something.
Exactly. The problem arises when this natural drive is either suppressed or, in the case of your Wall Street example, corrupted by a system that rewards the wrong metrics. When a system defines achievement purely through zero-sum status competition or financial hoarding, that natural drive for distinction turns into unhealthy domination.
So the argument is that the executive isn't actually seeking mastery. They are seeking domination because the system taught them that domination is the only valid form of superiority.
Precisely in line with the text logic. If the only way to prove you are the best in a given environment is to subjugate others or extract the most wealth, regardless of the collateral damage, the drive for distinction becomes predatory.
It mutates.
It does. The text proposes that a healthy system channels this innate drive into excellence in science, art, public service, athletics, or ethical business without requiring the humiliation, exploitation, or subjugation of others.
So you can be great without making someone else lose.
Exactly. It is achievement driven by the pursuit of excellence, not by the mechanics of domination. The white-collar criminal has a fractured CONAF because their need for healthy superiority has been warped into an insatiable need for unhealthy domination.
That distinction between excellence and domination is fascinating because it implies that human nature isn't inherently greedy or malicious. It's rather highly sensitive and responsive to its environment.
Highly responsive.
If you put a human in an environment that rewards extraction, they extract. If you put them in an environment that rewards communal mastery, they build. It frames human nature as something that flourishes when its base needs are met in healthy ways and turns toxic only when those needs are either starved or misdirected.
Which sets up the next major paradigm the authors explore. If human nature is this responsive to the system it inhabits, we are forced to critically examine the macro systems we have built.
The actual structures.
Yes. The text does this by contrasting what it calls a lower consciousness civilization with a higher consciousness civilization. They map this evolutionary contrast directly across the domains of the CONAF we just discussed, looking at how entire societies organize their resources and institutions.
And this is where the text moves from psychological theory to civilizational design. The authors are pointing out that for most of recorded history, societies organize themselves around survival, resource competition, and the accumulation of hard power.
Which made sense at the time.
Right. Those priorities worked to a degree. They produced the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, incredible technological leaps. We aren't dismissing the past. I mean, we wouldn't be recording this deep dive without the industrial leaps that secured our basic survival.
Absolutely not.
But the text proposes something called the oneness movement, suggesting that aligning our massive institutions with human interconnectedness and fulfillment is the necessary next stage of our development. We solved the food and shelter problem for a massive portion of the globe, so now we have to solve the thriving problem.
Let's break down how the text contrasts these two civilizational orientations, because the juxtaposition reveals a lot about our current structural assumptions.
Let's do it.
Let's start with safety. In what the text labels a lower consciousness civilization, the approach to safety relies heavily on reactive force, policing, massive prison infrastructure, and punitive justice.
Containment.
Right? It assumes danger is inevitable and must be contained. In a higher consciousness civilization, safety is achieved through upstream prevention, economic stability, and the cultivation of deep social trust.
Trust being the key metric there.
Exactly. The logic is that you don't need an armed presence on every corner if the community is cohesive, fundamentally secure in its resources, and supported by robust mental health infrastructure.
I need to interject here, listener, with a crucial note about impartiality, because the source material categorizes heavy reliance on expansive policing, immense incarceration systems, and military expansion as functions of a lower consciousness civilization.
It uses very specific terminology.
It does. And as your guides through this text, we are imparting the framework exactly as the authors present it. We are not taking a political stance, left or right, endorsing or condemning modern law enforcement or defense strategies.
We are just presenting the model.
Strictly examining the author's economic and structural argument that these massive expenditures are inherently reactive. They are responses to breakdowns in social order rather than proactive investments in human fulfillment. The text is looking purely at the mathematics of resource allocation and the downstream effects of those choices.
It is a structural analysis, observing that a system requiring massive defensive and punitive infrastructure is a system where fundamental needs are routinely failing at the ground level.
Well said.
Let's look at how this contrast plays out in the second domain, affirmation. The lower consciousness model points to our current reality, where individuals frequently seek affirmation through fleeting social media validation.
Counting likes.
Yes, and they engage in tribal conflict to feel part of an us versus a them.
The echo chambers.
The higher consciousness alternative outline of the text focuses on true community belonging, mutual care, intergenerational living, and robust, localized civic participation.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's make that tangible. I want you to think about what a normal Tuesday looks like in both of these civilizations.
I love this thought experiment.
In the lower consciousness model, which looks a lot like our current reality, you wake up. You check a device that quantifies your social worth in likes and views. You commute alone in a metal box to a job where your competence is measured by abstract metrics.
Highly isolated.
You return home, exhausted, and watch a screen that simulates human connection or stokes outrage against a political other so you feel part of a tribe. You are isolated, but hyper-stimulated.
Very common Tuesday.
Now contrast that with the text's vision of a higher consciousness Tuesday. You wake up in a neighborhood designed for spontaneous interaction, not just car storage.
Walkable communities.
Your work is deeply integrated with your local community's needs, utilizing your actual mastery. Your affirmation comes from looking a neighbor in the eye and knowing you contributed to their well-being. It sounds idyllic, almost utopian. Is the text arguing this is actually achievable, or is it just a philosophical thought experiment?
The authors argue it is not only achievable, but mathematically necessary for our survival.
Mathematically necessary.
Yes. They contend that the normal Tuesday you first described, the isolated, hyperstimulated existence, is physically and economically unsustainable. And that brings us to the most heavily emphasized, data-driven section of the source material.
The true cost of a fractured CONAF.
Or what we might call the budget of despair. The authors move aggressively from philosophy to hard economics, looking at how lower consciousness systems allocate their vast resources. They analyze the staggering expenditures required to manage the brutal consequences of unmet human needs.
This is where we need to spend some serious time, because this is the core of the argument. Let's break down this massive budget of despair category by category, starting with war and the military-industrial complex.
A massive sector.
The text notes that nations like the United States spend hundreds of billions of dollars, nearing $1 trillion, annually on weapon systems, overseas bases, and advanced military technology. Again, maintaining our neutral lens on the text's analysis, the authors ask a profound, upstream question.
What causes the conflict?
What conditions reduce the likelihood of war in the first place? Instead of just funding the military to manage inevitable conflicts, a CONAF-oriented society would view global stability, diplomacy, environmental security, and human well-being around the world as the primary defense budget.
It reframes defense entirely.
They argued that preventing the desperation and resource competition that spark conflicts is a more efficient use of capital than fighting the conflicts.
The text forces us to look at the opportunity cost. Every dollar spent on a reactive weapons system is a dollar not spent on establishing the global conditions that would make that weapon system unnecessary.
Right.
It's the difference between buying a more advanced fire extinguisher and ensuring the house isn't constructed out of dry kindling.
I love that. Dry kindling.
The next massive expenditure the text analyzes is incarceration and policing. We touched on this, but the economic breakdown is vital. In the current model, crime is frequently treated purely as a law enforcement issue, a failure of individual morality that must be punished, contained, and managed through the judicial system.
But the text argues that many drivers of crime arise directly from a fractured CONAF. Poverty, physical insecurity, lack of community belonging, limited opportunities for genuine mastery, generational trauma, and untreated mental illness.
All upstream factors.
Maintaining massive prison systems, funding the courts, managing the probation systems, this costs an astronomical amount of money. The text posits that upstream prevention, guaranteed stable housing, education focused on mastery rather than testing, universal mental health support actually costs far less over time and produces vastly better civilizational outcomes.
It's cheaper to house someone and treat their trauma than it is to incarcerate them for a decade.
Exactly.
The math heavily supports that conclusion. The lifetime cost of incarcerating an individual is staggering, yet society readily absorbs that cost because it fits the reactive, punitive model we are accustomed to.
It's just the accepted cost of doing business.
Right. Investing a fraction of that amount into early childhood intervention or community mental health clinics is often viewed as too expensive or utopian, simply because the return on investment isn't immediately visible on a quarterly balance sheet. The text exposes the profound irrationality of this economic behavior.
Let's carry that irrationality over to the healthcare system, specifically looking at chronic disease, because this blew my mind.
It's a huge shift in perspective.
The text highlights that many of the most expensive, debilitating health conditions today are deeply linked to lifestyle, stress, and environmental factors. We are talking about cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, obesity, severe depression, autoimmune disorders.
The chronic conditions that dominate healthcare spending.
Exactly. These are heavily exacerbated by chronic stress, poor diets forced by economic necessity, sedentary jobs, and severe social isolation. Right now, our healthcare systems spend immense, unimaginable resources treating these conditions after they have ravaged the body.
The mechanism of that ravaging is important to understand, because the text isn't just speaking metaphorically.
It's biological.
It is entirely biological. When a person is trapped in an environment with a fractured CONAF, say, they have high job insecurity, low social support, and lack a sense of meaning, their body is in a constant state of low-grade fight or flight.
Their system thinks it's under attack.
Yes. The amygdala is constantly firing. This leads to chronically elevated cortisol levels, which leads to systemic inflammation.
The silent killer.
Over years, that inflammation damages the arterial walls, impairs insulin resistance, and degrades the immune system. The resulting heart attack or diabetes diagnosis isn't a sudden anomaly. It is the final, predictable biological collapse after years of structural stress.
And the economic response to that collapse is fascinating. A person works a high-stress, low-meaning job for 30 years. Their biology finally breaks down under the weight of a starved CONAF. And then the system spends $500,000 on a bypass surgery, medications, and specialized care to keep them alive.
It's a miracle of science, but...
Right. The medical intervention is a marvel of science, but the text is screaming, why did we structure society to break their heart in the first place?
That is the crucial question.
The text envisions a shift where we emphasize healthy environments, humane work-life balance, access to quality nutrition, and strong social networks as primary preventative medicine.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we see a remarkably clear pattern emerging from the source material. Prevention is economically cheaper than repair. Cultivation is more efficient than containment.
It just makes mathematical sense.
But the text also brings up two other massive, often overlooked economic burdens. Loneliness and environmental degradation.
Loneliness as an economic burden. That's wild to think about.
It is. Loneliness is increasingly recognized not just as a sad emotional state, but as a profound public health crisis. The text points out that social isolation is linked to rapid cognitive decline, increased risk of dementia, higher rates of substance abuse, and a significantly increased mortality risk.
It's literally killing us.
It has a physiological impact comparable to smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. The economic strain this places on elder care, mental health services, and emergency rooms is immense.
I think we really need to sit with that for a second. We literally have a civilizational model that produces loneliness at an industrial scale.
Industrial scale loneliness.
We build suburbs that require a car to get a gallon of milk, isolating people in single-family homes. We design workplaces that pit employees against each other in zero-sum competitions for promotions. We design social media algorithms that isolate us in echo chambers.
All working exactly as designed.
And then we act surprised when the Surgeon General announces an epidemic of loneliness. The text forces us to admit that this isolation is a design feature of a lower consciousness society, not a bug.
It's baked into the blueprint.
And then there is the environmental piece. Environmental degradation is framed by the authors not just as a loss of beautiful nature, but as a fractured relationship that creates massive, unavoidable economic costs.
Exactly. When a society views the environment merely as a stockpile of resources to be extracted for immediate economic gain, a very lower consciousness orientation, it fractures the foundational domain of safety and security for future generations.
Because the bill comes due eventually.
It always does. The economic costs of this fracture are astronomical. Disaster recovery from intensified weather events, agricultural instability requiring massive subsidies, the destruction of coastal infrastructure, and the inevitable displacement of populations.
It's a massive drain on resources.
The text argues that a CONAF-oriented society understands that human flourishing is biologically tethered to ecological flourishing. You cannot maintain the top of the pyramid if the base is dissolving.
So, if we take all this in, the cost of reactive defense, the cost of mass incarceration, the $500,000 heart attacks, the epidemic of loneliness, the climate disasters, the budget of despair is undeniably bankrupting us.
It's completely unsustainable.
A CONAF civilization essentially flips the entire national budget. It takes all those trillions spent on the back end, on the cleanup, and moves those funds aggressively upstream.
Into the foundation.
You invest heavily in early childhood development, ensuring every brain has a secure foundation. You build universal, easily accessible mental health infrastructure. You completely redesign urban spaces to foster community interaction rather than just facilitating car traffic and consumerism.
You fund massive ecological restoration projects.
It is an entirely different blueprint for how a society operates.
But this transition from repair to prevention brings us to one of the most provocative, deep-cutting arguments in the entire text. It deals with the crisis of stimulation and the trap of addiction.
This part is so relevant today.
It is. The text observes that human beings are fundamentally, naturally curious and energetic creatures. We are biologically wired to seek stimulation, not just for mindless pleasure, but for exploration, creativity, problem-solving, and personal growth.
It's how we evolved.
It is a survival mechanism that drives innovation.
But, and this is a massive friction point in the text, modern systems often actively suppress this natural curiosity. The text calls out our educational systems for prioritizing standardized, rote outcomes over actual discovery.
Memorization over exploration.
Exactly. We take 5-year-olds who are bursting with questions about how the universe works, and we put them in rows and tell them to memorize facts for a test. And then those children graduate into economic structures that force them into highly specialized, repetitive jobs that provide financial survival, sure, but absolutely zero intrinsic fulfillment.
They are essentially numbed.
So you have an entire population with a deeply ingrained evolutionary need for high-level stimulation, trapped in environments that are numbingly unstimulating, rigid, or actively stressful.
This systemic mismatch raises a critical question, and it's where the text makes a remarkably bold, paradigm-shifting claim. Addiction is rarely the root problem in society.
Wait, say that again?
Addiction is rarely the root problem. It is almost always a symptom of a fractured CONAF.
Wow.
The text argues that when individuals lack belonging, purpose, competence, or meaning, they experience a profound internal emptiness, a psychological void. And what do modern economies do brilliantly?
They sell you things to fill the void.
They monetize that void. They monetize attention and the desire for stimulation. They offer easily accessible, intense, but incredibly shallow forms of stimulation to fill the emptiness.
We are talking about the obvious things like chemical substances, drugs, and alcohol, yes. But the text broadens the definition of addiction significantly.
Very significantly.
It points to the endless dopamine loops of digital entertainment. The algorithmic feeds designed by thousands of engineers to keep you scrolling. Compulsive consumerism, buying things you don't need to feel a momentary spike of satisfaction.
Retail therapy.
Right. The text argues that these addictive technologies and industries thrive precisely because people lack deep, meaningful fulfillment elsewhere in their lives. The shallow stimulation becomes a necessary distraction from the agonizing emptiness of a fractured CONAF.
Think about the systemic failure of how we currently address this. What happens when an entire society treats addiction solely through prohibition, criminalization, or individual punishment?
It doesn't work.
No. You throw someone in a prison cell for substance abuse, or you debate banning a specific app, or you tell people just have more willpower. But you completely ignore the deep structural emptiness that drove the population to seek that chemical or digital escape in the first place.
You're just cutting off the supply, not the demand.
Exactly. The text argues that removing the substance without filling the void is a guaranteed failure. You're just forcing the individual to find a different mechanism to cope with the starvation of their basic needs.
It's like taking the painkillers away from someone with a broken leg and telling them to just walk it off without ever actually setting the bone.
A perfect analogy.
The text contrasts this distraction from emptiness model with a fulfilled CONAF environment,
Right.
where stimulation transforms from an escape into a source of vitality. When you have a society that actually supports authentic curiosity and joyful exploration, creativity replaces boredom.
Deep, meaningful engagement replaces the need for constant, shallow escapism.
And the authors are very clear that supporting this level of engagement isn't a frivolous luxury for the elite. It is an essential component of human fulfillment that actually makes citizens more innovative, resilient, and economically productive in a healthy way.
It builds a stronger society.
So what does that actually look like in practice? How do we build infrastructure for healthy stimulation?
The text paints a really vivid picture of proposed solutions here. It's about creating flexible, non-linear career pathways, so people aren't trapped doing one meaningless task for 40 years out of fear of losing their health care.
That fear locks so many people in.
It really does. It's also about urban planning that builds public spaces explicitly for creative collaboration. Music, art, sports, debate.
Third places.
Yes. It's about providing widespread, free access to tools, workshops, and laboratories where regular citizens can just build, experiment, and tinker.
Imagine walking through a city where there are as many community workshops, communal gardens, and art studios as there are fast food drive-thrus or bank branches.
That is what a society investing in healthy stimulation looks like.
Which brings us to the ultimate pragmatic challenge of the text, measuring what matters and the path forward. If we accept the premise that the true purpose of civilization is human flourishing, then the authors argue that our current gold standard metric, gross domestic product, or GDP, is deeply flawed, if not actively harmful, when used as the sole indicator of national success.
GDP measures velocity, not health.
Now, we all know GDP is essentially blind to morality. It measures economic activity, not civilizational health. But the text takes this critique much further.
Right, because a country can grow financially richer, its GDP can skyrocket, while its citizens simultaneously grow lonelier, more anxious, more addicted, and more disconnected from any sense of purpose.
We know the classic paradoxes. A massive oil spill actually boosts GDP because of the millions spent on the cleanup effort.
Which is insane when you think about it.
A surge in cancer rates or a massive multi-car pileup boosts GDP through healthcare spending and auto repair. It measures motion, regardless of the direction.
It's an incredibly blunt instrument.
The text essentially says, if you navigate your civilization using a broken compass, don't be surprised when you sail off the edge of the map.
To correct this navigation, the text introduces the concept of the CONAF score.
The CONAF score.
The premise is simple but revolutionary. If you want society to prioritize human fulfillment, you have to actually measure human fulfillment with the same rigor and obsession that we currently measure financial output.
You manage what you measure.
Exactly. A national CONAF score would fundamentally change the data points that politicians, economists, and urban planners care about. It would measure the prevalence of positive psychological well-being, not just the absence of disease.
It would track addiction rates, but also loneliness levels.
And the depth of social networks. It would measure community participation, civic engagement, and crucially, citizens' self-reported sense of purpose and mastery.
Imagine the shift in public discourse. Imagine turning on the evening news or checking a financial app, and instead of hearing, the stock market's up 200 points today, the lead story is, the National Loneliness Index dropped by 2% this quarter, and our community purpose metrics have hit an all-time high.
It completely changes the goalposts of what it means to be a successful nation.
It really does. And under this new metric, mental health would undergo a massive paradigm shift.
It would have to. The text explicitly states that in a CONAF-based nation, mental health would no longer be a marginal reactive healthcare specialty that you access only when you are in an acute crisis.
It would be the baseline.
It would become the absolute center of social design. Every piece of legislation, every urban planning decision, every labor law would be run through a new filter. Does this policy support or fracture the psychological well-being and fulfillment of the population?
It changes everything from tax code to zoning laws.
Instead of addressing the symptoms of anxiety and depression in clinical isolation, society would focus on restoring the whole circle of fulfillment at the macro level.
So what does this all mean? How do we actually get from here to there? Because I can hear you, the listener, thinking right now, this sounds like a lovely utopian sci-fi movie, but how on earth do we dismantle the budget of despair and implement a CONAF score?
It's the natural next question.
The text doesn't leave us hanging in the clouds. It outlines a very deliberate bridge. It acknowledges that we can't just flip a switch overnight and dismantle the reactive economy. It talks about starting with highly targeted, incremental reforms.
Those incremental steps are crucial for the transition. The authors suggest beginning with the immediate expansion of preventative mental health services, moving them out of clinics and into schools and workplaces.
Making them ubiquitous.
Right. They advocate for redesigning school curriculums right now to focus more on mastery, critical thinking, and collaborative problem solving, and less on rigid, standardized testing.
So kids actually learn how to think, not just test.
Exactly. They point to actively working to reduce reliance on incarceration through massive targeted community investment in marginalized areas.
Going back to that upstream investment.
These are actionable policies that build the foundation for the long-term civilizational vision, which is an entire economy organically designed around human flourishing rather than endless linear consumption.
It's about changing the trajectory by 1 degree today, so that in 50 years we arrive at a completely different destination. The text emphasizes that this vision does not require human perfection immediately. It simply requires a fundamental shift in agreement about the ultimate measure of a civilization.
A shift in our compass.
It's the realization that designing civilization around human fulfillment isn't just some soft, compassionate dream for idealists. It is, mathematically, sociologically, and economically, the most rational, practical, and unsentimental thing a society can do to ensure its own long-term survival and resilience.
That is the ultimate synthesis of the source material. We started today by recognizing the glaring irony of our reactive civilization, a massively complex system that spends its vast wealth managing the symptoms of a despair it helped create.
The ambulances at the bottom of the cliff?
We walked through the 7 domains of the CONAF, recognizing that safety, belonging, mastery, and meaning are not optional. They are structural biological necessities.
We can't thrive without them.
We contrasted the lower consciousness reliance on punishment, extraction, and shallow distraction with the higher consciousness vision of prevention, deep engagement, and true mastery.
2 Tuesdays.
Yes. We examined the staggering economic waste embedded in the budget of despair. And finally, we look at how replacing the flawed compass of GDP with a CONAF score could reorient our entire civilizational trajectory toward true, sustainable flourishing.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to connect this directly back to your daily life. We've spent an hour talking about macroeconomics, systemic sociology, and global civilizational design. But tomorrow, when you wake up, pour your coffee and look at your phone.
Right, back to reality.
The next time you see a news headline about a societal crisis, a crime wave, a debate over national defense budgets, or an addiction epidemic, you now have a completely new lens to look through.
A powerful framework.
You can ask yourself, are the solutions being debated by these politicians just buying more advanced ambulances for the bottom of the cliff? Are we just arguing over how to best manage the despair? Or is anyone actually talking about investing in fulfilling the fundamental human needs that prevent the fall?
It is an incredibly powerful filter for critical thinking, especially in an age of intense information overload and political polarization.
Yeah.
It allows you to cut through the noise, bypass the superficial debates, and get straight to the root of human architecture.
It really does.
It changes the questions you ask of your leaders and your institutions.
It changes everything. And I want to leave you with one final provocative thought. Something for you to mull over on your commute or while you're walking the dog later. The text proposes a massive, complex national CONAF score to replace GDP for an entire country. But what if you shrunk that blueprint down? What if you applied that exact same metric to your own life today?
Oh, that's interesting.
Imagine if your own household or your team at work was audited tomorrow morning. Not on its financial output, not on its productivity metrics or its profit margins, but strictly on its CONAF score.
A personal fulfillment audit.
If your daily life was graded on its levels of genuine belonging, your opportunities for true mastery, and your shared sense of purpose, what is the very first thing you would realize you need to redesign?
That is a brilliant diagnostic question. It brings the massive civilizational blueprint right down into the living room where all societal change ultimately has to begin.
It absolutely does. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. It's been an absolute privilege unpacking this blueprint with you and wrestling with these massive ideas.
It's been a great conversation.
Stay curious, keep looking for those fences instead of the ambulances, and we will catch you on the next one. Take care.